Chapter 1, Winds of Change. A bead of perspiration rolled down his forehead and into his eye. Salt in the perspiration stung his eye and blurred his vision, making the task of reading the letter in his hands even more difficult. The letter was from his wealthy uncle and was written in Japanese kanji. That fact, along with what his uncle was expressing, made reading the letter a slow and painful process for Mickey. He had been born in Japan, but had moved to the United States at age 5 to live with his grandparents after his parents had died in an accident. If his grandparents hadn't insisted that he had learned to read kanji, he would have had no hope of understanding his uncle's letter. Still, just because he understood the fundamentals of reading kanji didn't mean reading handwritten kanji was easy, not to mention that he had only spoken Japanese a handful of times in his last 30 years. Mickey Yamamoto paused from reading the letter and glanced at the thermometer, 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Simultaneously and ironically, a malaria-induced chill came over him and he shivered. He reached across the table for a bottle of quinine tablets, hoping that the medicine would ward off his symptoms. After taking the pills, he needed to eat a cheese sandwich because the medicine couldn't be taken on an empty stomach. Perhaps the ultimatum his doctor had given him was correct after all. What had the doctor told him just last week in Port Moresby? He needed to leave Papua New Guinea for his health, and the sooner the better. After taking the quinine, he went back to deciphering the letter. It appeared his uncle was apologizing for sending him off to live with his grandparents instead of taking care of Mickey himself. With that much of the letter understood, Mickey paused for a moment and thanked God that his uncle had sent him off to live with his grandparents. How different his life would have turned out if his uncle hadn't done that. Then the letter went on to diplomatically explain that his uncle was pleased to have been able to support Mickey in his missionary endeavors all these years, but now it was time to ask for a favor in return. The letter revealed that his uncle was suffering from a terminal illness, and the doctors had given him 2 years to live, at the most. His impending death frightened him, and he wanted Mickey to come and stay with him until the end. His uncle's letter went on to explain that he didn't need Mickey to take care of him. His wealth would see to it he received the finest care. The reason he needed Mickey was to show him how to become a Kiristokyo. Mickey couldn't believe his eyes. Had he read that correctly? Kiristokyo translated Christian. He reread that part of the letter. Yes, it appeared his uncle was expressing a desire to become a Christian. Mickey's late grandparents had always prayed about this and said this day would come, and now it had. He stopped his reading and offered a prayer of thanks to his heavenly Father. His euphoria at his uncle's request was quickly tempered by the reality of his situation. He was a mission pilot, the only one in the area. Other missionaries depended upon him. He had already turned in his plan to retire to his missions board, but he was committed to continue flying for another 9 months until the end of May. He couldn't just leave all the people that depended upon him hanging. Besides this commitment, there was also some fear at the thought of returning to Japan. After all, he had left Japan at age 5, so he could speak Japanese as well as any 5-year-old. Would his language skills be good enough to express himself adequately, or would they make him a laughing stock? Mickey's uncle was asking him to come to Japan now. If he waited for 9 months to leave Papua New Guinea as he had been planning, would it be too late? Who could say when his uncle would succumb to his illness? 30 years as a pilot missionary in the mountain jungles had taken a toll on Mickey's health. He had his first bout of malaria shortly after arriving in New Guinea, despite being on anti-malarial medicine. How he had contracted malaria had always been a mystery to Mickey because he had seldom ever seen a mosquito. It still seemed strange to him that there weren't more mosquitoes in the jungle. A second bout of malaria came about 15 years into his missionary tour. It was at that time he discovered that the newer medicines for malaria caused him problems. That is why he was on the old-fashioned but proven quinine. Mickey could almost say the bitter taste of quinine didn't bother him anymore. Plus, the fact that quinine was cheaper pleased him. His health had been deteriorating for some time, but recently it had been quickly going downhill. Not only was his malaria acting up, but the doctor had found his body was infested with two types of parasites. The doctor had put him on a course of treatment for the parasites, but had warned him that he needed to remove himself from all possible sources of infection. That meant leaving Papua New Guinea. It seemed to him the Lord was calling for him to leave as surely as he had called him to come. However, Mickey knew that the mission board had a pilot lined up to replace him in 9 months, but the new pilot wouldn't be able to come until then. He just couldn't leave the missionaries and native people that depended upon him without a pilot. What he needed was a pilot willing to replace him until the mission board could send their new pilot. But that would be a tall order to fill, because a pilot would have to be willing and able to supply his own support. The support wasn't just food, clothing, and incidentals. It would need to include enough money for aviation fuel and maintenance on the aircraft. With the recent increase in fuel prices, that amounted to the equivalent of thousands of US dollars every month needed for support. Not only would a replacement pilot need to be willing to live in primitive conditions, but he would have to be willing to pay for the privilege. Because of his benefactor, Mickey had been uniquely suited to the missionary pilot position. His uncle had never complained about the ever-increasing outlay of cash every month. Besides wanting to see his uncle accept Christ, Mickey felt obligated to honor his uncle's request because of all the monetary support he had provided over the years. But how could he leave now? After he prayed about this problem, Mickey did what he always did. He turned the problem over to the Lord, blew out the oil lamp, and went to bed. After all, there was no use in losing sleep over it, and the Lord was going to be up all night anyway. If the Lord was as true to form in solving this problem as he had been in all the seemingly insurmountable and serious problems that had arisen in the last 30 years, the answer would present itself within the next few days. Mickey woke the next morning to more malaria-induced shivers. He rose from his bed, took more quinine, and ate some stale biscuits for breakfast. He needed to take quinine 3 times a day, and his frequent symptoms meant that he couldn't accidentally forget a dose. His native housekeeper, Martha, would be angry that he hadn't waited for her to arrive and make him his breakfast. That is an easy problem to solve, Mickey thought. I won't tell her I have already eaten and will just eat a second breakfast. That thought reminded Mickey of something his old friend Paul Sinhuna would have done, which in turn gave him the possible answer to his other problem. Why hadn't I thought of Paul before? Mickey questioned himself. Paul had been his childhood friend. They grew up together. Through Paul, he had learned English, and through Mickey, Paul had learned Japanese. Somehow or another, they had both decided to become pilot missionaries to Papua New Guinea. The exact reason for this had been lost to time, but Mickey remembered how disappointed Paul had been when the mission board told them there was only one opening for a pilot. The mission board made the decision to send Mickey because of his uncle's offer of support, and because Paul had recently married. There were hints of a possible second opening for a pilot, but it never did materialize. Mickey knew that Paul had become a builder and contractor. Builders made a lot of money, didn't they? Perhaps Paul could afford to supply his own support. The question was whether or not he was still a pilot. Paul and Joan had sent him Christmas cards every year until a few years ago. Joan usually included a brief summary of what had occurred over the last year. Mickey remembered that the Sinhunas had raised 2 girls who were now grown, and that Joan had come down with some type of illness. Then the Christmas cards had stopped. The Christmas cards Mickey continued to send had not come back, but that might have happened even if they had gone undelivered. Also, Mickey couldn't remember any of the cards he received making any reference to flying. Perhaps Paul had given up flying, but the idea that Paul might be a possible replacement pilot was still worth a shot. Retrieving the trunk where he kept all his correspondence, Mickey searched through it until he found the Sinhuna's latest Christmas card. He read through the writing and found what he was hoping for, a phone number. He couldn't call from the mission station, for there wasn't any phone there. However, the plane for the next day called for flying a missionary to Port Moresby, and if he timed it right, he could call from there. After all, he would be spending a few days in a hotel waiting for a replacement missionary to arrive. He began searching through the trunk again. This time, he was looking for a small map of the world which had the time zones on it. He needed to determine the time difference between time in Papua New Guinea and the time in northern Michigan. Just then, his native housekeeper Martha and her handyman husband Tubal showed up. They both spoke Pidgin English along with everyone from their village. Pidgin English, also known as trade language, is English with a few native words thrown in and a little different grammar. Many English speakers can understand most of it after a few hours of exposure, just as long as the speaker isn't excited and speaking too fast. Martha began cooking the eggs she had collected that morning for their breakfast. Tubal and Martha had been providing their services to Mickey without any compensation for years. It was their way of thanking the Lord and Mickey for bringing the gospel to this part of Papua New Guinea. They were grateful for the changes that Christianity had brought to their tribe. The whole community had accepted Christ back when they were still both children. Tubal and Martha had not practiced cannibalism themselves, but their older relatives had. Before Christianity brought peace to the surrounding area, their tribe had been at war with neighboring tribes as long as anyone could remember. They hated the neighboring tribes for working evil magic against them and stealing their pigs and women. Those were the exact same reasons that the other tribes hated their tribe. The couple in their late 20s would have likely been among the oldest people in the tribe just a few generations ago. It was almost unheard of for any of the native New Guinea people to reach the age of 30. Malaria had been the biggest reason for short lifespan. However, now that missionaries had brought modern medicine to heal the body and Christianity to make peace between the tribes, the average life expectancy had greatly increased. Officially, cannibalism ceased to exist in the 1970s, although it may have continued longer in some extremely remote tribes. Normally, the oldest male elder of a New Guinea village is considered the leader. There were several older males in the village, but none of them wanted the responsibility of being the leader. So Tubal had inherited the leader title early. Everyone in the village recognized him as the leader, and it was fortunate for the village that none of the older men wanted to be leader, because Tubal was both sharp-witted and wise. Tubal and Martha frequently ate breakfast with Mickey and considered it an honor. Usually they brought their children with them, but today the children were off with some friends at the village. Mickey was greatly revered by the people of the village, not only because of the help he gave them through his missionary endeavors, but also because of his advanced age of 52. There are still only a small number of elders in the tribe who had surpassed such an advanced age. Mickey knew how the native people felt about his age, and it both amused and annoyed him. Whenever there was any physical labor to perform, the people of the village always tried to prevent him from doing it, like he was somehow infirmed by his great age. While he ate breakfast with Tubal and Martha, Mickey broached the subject about how his uncle was terminally ill and had asked him to return to Japan to explain Christianity to him. Tubal and Martha expressed concern for Mickey's uncle. Then Mickey told them that he was planning to contact his old friend to see if he would be able to come to be a replacement pilot. Both Tubal and Martha knew that the mission board would be sending a replacement pilot. They had come to accept the fact that Mickey would be leaving in May, but the thought of their friend leaving sooner brought tears to their eyes. No amount of physical pain, despite the severity, could ever bring tears to their eyes. Nevertheless, tears flowed down their cheeks at the thought of their friend's upcoming departure. Their tears bothered Mickey, and he related, "My friends, to everything there is a season and a purpose for everything under heaven." Quoting from Ecclesiastes, "I'm sad to leave also, but I believe that God is telling me that my time here is coming to an end." Then Mickey told his friends that he needed to build new living quarters. "The pilot the mission board will send in May has a family. This one-room hut was more than adequate for me, but my replacement will need larger living quarters with at least 3 bedrooms, he stated. Tubal responded, "Tubal will tell everyone in the village tonight, and soon we start building a new lodge dwelling for the new family." Not only did Tubal keep his word by telling the village that night, but he also sent off a runner to the next village and a different tribe. The other tribe was a 4-hour run away and higher on the mountain. The higher elevation was more open and didn't have the thick jungle that surrounded Tubal's village. Normally, a runner wouldn't travel at night, but that night there was a full moon and it was important to let the other tribe help also. Just 40 years ago, the other tribe had been blood enemies of Tubal's tribe, but now the two tribes were friendly because of the love of Christ. Christianity had made a night and day difference in many areas of Papua New Guinea. It was late at night when the runner reached the village of the other tribe. He went straight for the longhouse. Once there, he woke everyone up and made his announcement. Immediately the other tribe decided which member should have the honor of going and helping to build the new missionary quarters. The delegation, which included most of the adults in the tribe, both men and women, retrieved their machetes and set off in the night so they could reach Tubal's village by daylight. The women do almost all the work in most New Guinea villages, but building is the one thing in which the whole village becomes involved. Mickey knew that some preparations were being made to start building the new missionary living quarters while he was away. However, he didn't know that the natives were planning to have the entire building completed before he returned from Port Moresby in a few days. They didn't want Mickey to overextend himself working on the construction because of his advanced age. That morning, Mickey flew the plane to the Upland Mission Station and picked up the missionary who was being rotated back to the States. The plan was to then fly to Port Moresby so the missionary could catch a larger plane for the first leg of his trip. Mickey would be spending a few days there in a hotel while he waited for the replacement missionary to arrive. He was looking forward to the modern conveniences the hotel had to offer, such as hot and cold running water and the inside bathroom. Mickey knew he had been overexerting himself, and that was the wrong thing to do for his current medical condition. The rest would help him recoup from his malaria. This stay would also give him a chance to try to contact Paul Sinhina and find out if Paul would be willing to come and replace him for a few months.